Pleasure to be here. Good afternoon. I did a talk for Jim, I don't know how many years ago, about 20 years ago, and it's good to be back and talk a little bit about Caspar Creek. Jim and I are kind of the old timers now, and I get to do the history lesson on Caspar Creek. Sally Diamond will follow me and talk about the current things that are going on in Caspar Creek. I have been involved in Caspar Creek in one way or another for over 30 years. I worked on the forest, Jackson Demonstration State Forest, and Caspar Creek in the 1980s, and have continued to have involvement in the project for the last couple decades, currently managing the contract with the Forest Service on the project. So happy to tell you a few words about it today. So first, I wanted to illustrate that long-term, continuously running watershed studies are really rare in the United States. There aren't that many. You can see about a handful here. I think George Ice, now retired from Nicosi, had 13 in this diagram. And you can see when I'm talking about long-term continuous, I'm talking about on the order of 40 or 50 years. And Caspar Creek is the only one in California with that kind of long-term record in a forested setting. Some of the other ones you may have heard about, the Alsea and H.G. Andrews in Oregon, Hubbard Brook in New Hampshire, and so forth. But they are obviously rare, and they're costly and take a big commitment. So Caspar Creek is a cooperative project between CAL FIRE, Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, and the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station, or PSW. And it has been in existence since 1962. Which means we have at least 53 years of data. There's a 100-year agreement in place with the Forest Service that we update and sign every 5 years with the station director and our director. Just signed it a month ago, and guarantees the project will continue through 2099. So a very, very long-term project. There are over 150 papers, master's theses, dissertations available online from Caspar Creek. All of our publications have been put on the web. We have two main experiments we've done to date, the North Fork experiment and the South Fork experiment, and I'm going to talk about those in a little bit of depth. And then I'm going to bring Sally Diamond, our postdoc researcher, up to talk about the third experiment. So Caspar Creek is a small coastal watershed, about 5,300 acres, drains into the Pacific Ocean, just below Fort Bragg, the town of Fort Bragg in western Mendocino County. The experimental watersheds themselves, where we've made our measurements, are in the headwaters of the North Fork and the headwaters of the South Fork. And almost all of the larger Caspar Creek watershed is on Jackson Demonstration State Forest, about 90% of it. I've had the pleasure of working with a number of excellent researchers over my career from the PSW who have led this project, including Ray Rice, Bob Zemer, Tom Lyle, Leslie Reed, and currently Matt Bussey. All have done an excellent job leading the Caspar Creek project. In terms of monitored variables in Caspar Creek, as you'd imagine, we measure stream flow, peak flows, low flows, annual water yield, sediment, both suspended sediment and bed load, erosion variables such as landslides, gully erosion, bank failures, and so forth. And then aquatic and riparian parameters such as large wood, water temperature, fish, macroinvertebrates, nutrients, and several others as well. In terms of the physical setting, it receives about just under 1,200 millimeters of annual precipitation, about 46 inches of rain. Sedimentary bedrock from the Franciscan Formation, steep erodible terrain that's subject to landslides when we have large storms, well-drained loam soils, second growth and now third growth redwood and Douglas fir forest, and then the fish are coho, salmon, and steelhead in the Class 1 watercourses. The headwaters themselves are fairly small drainages, only about 1,100 acres. The second growth forest looks like this. I took this photo in the North Fork a couple of years ago, now over 100 years old. You can see the redwood trees and Douglas fir. Just a little bit of older history. These are not pristine watersheds. They're not totally reference watersheds in the classic sense. They were logged around 1860s to 1904, first with oxen and splash dams, and then later a small part was logged with railroad inclines, and steam donkeys. So in case you haven't seen what oxen logging looks like, this is an actual photo from Caspar Creek, illustrating the oxen teams that were hooked up that dragged the logs down skid trails down to the stream channel. This is not actually Caspar Creek, but it illustrates how the logs were stacked in the stream channel below the splash dams. This is an actual splash dam in the South Fork, a crib log construction, and a couple times during the winter they would trigger the splash dams and send a freshet of water down to flush the logs down to the mill at the ocean. Now this was imprecise. Fully about half the logs that tried to make it down to the ocean went on past out into the ocean, so there was a lot of effort that was wasted sending these logs down the splash dams. And as you can imagine, the stream channels were heavily impacted by this type of impact, and even today we still see these impacts from the old growth logging. So now I'll say a few words about the first experiment, the South Fork Caspar Creek experiment. It's a classic paired watershed study. When it was set up in the early 60s, the North Fork, the trees were a little bit younger than the South Fork, so the South Fork was selected as a treatment watershed. The main stem weirs were built, large concrete weirs, in 1962. There was a calibration period from 62 to 66 to develop relationships between the two watersheds so we could predict what would occur, what we'd expect to occur in terms of flow and sediment. And then the South Fork had a haul road that was built up it right along the stream channel, over 4 miles of road in 67. We monitored that impact and then selectively harvested the South Fork from 71 to 73 without any modern forest practice rules, no rules that would require roads to be constructed properly, skid trails to be placed away from streams and so forth. So just a few photos to illustrate what this looked like, building the concrete weirs in 1962 at both the North Fork and the South Fork. The original sediment monitoring was done with DH-48 hand samplers and then also supplemented with glass bottles that were mounted on the weir face called rising stage or fixed stage samplers, so we'd at least get some samples when the stage rose if nobody was out there to collect hand samples. Annually, and we still do this today, we monitor the weir pond for bedload sediment accumulation after every winter to see what's come in from the winter storms from the previous winter. This is a photo of, you can see the arrow pointing here to a crawler tractor or bulldozer building the road up the South Fork in September of 1967. You can see there's a lot of turbid water, a lot of slashed soil, rocks that were deposited directly in the stream channel. Again, this is before the modern forest practice rules that would prohibit anything like this from occurring today. They built small bridges across the South Fork with the tractors operating directly in the stream channel, again something that wouldn't occur today. This is what the road looked like in 67 with an air photo. You can see that about 75% of the road was directly, or not directly, but within 200 feet of the stream channel. Again, practices that would not occur under the modern forest practice rules. And then, as I said, we logged the South Fork with tractors in 71 to 73 with 3 separate timber sales. They took 65% of the stand volume off, heavily thinned it. It looked like this. All the logging done with crawler tractors, putting skid trails near headwater streams, actually skidding in the streams, building landings near streams or in streams, all practices that would not occur today. And looking at the air photo after the logging in 75, you can see that there's a huge amount of disturbance. 50% of the land base was compacted in roads, skid trails, and landings, which was about 5 times more than we'd see in the second experiment in the North Fork. So briefly, for some results for the South Fork, the roading resulted in sediment, suspended sediment being elevated about twice what we predicted it would be from the North Fork. And then with the logging, we had suspended sediment being elevated 4 to 5 times above what we would have expected based on pre-treatment levels. And landslides related to roads, skid trails, and landings were the dominant sediment source. Now, Ray Rice was the principal investigator at the time, and he created this graphic showing the deviations of sediment yield from that predicted, and you can see it was much, much higher after logging, particularly the first 6 years, We thought it had settled down and come to pre-treatment levels by 1980. By the 1990s, we saw the old road along the stream channel starting to fall apart, particularly during the El Nino winter of 97-98, where we had 5 large landslides. So the old road really was built poorly, and because we had a long-term watershed experiment, we were picking up this impact that wouldn't have been picked up otherwise. We abandoned 3 miles of the road with hydraulic excavators removing 26 crossings. Unfortunately, 3 of the crossings we didn't excavate quite deep enough, so we had some significant channel incision and headward channel movement of sediment. If you look at this slide showing sediment yield for 1963 through 2006, you can see the elevated period with the logging in the mid-70s, and then an elevated period again with the road failures shown in red, and the road decommissioning had a price to pay as well, shown in yellow there. Just a few words about the North Fork experiment, and again I could talk about these for hours, but I don't have that kind of time, so this is very quick. The North Fork was designed to look at cumulative watershed effects, so we had a nested experimental design. We had 8 subbasins that were instrumented with Parshall, Flumes, and then we had 5 main stem stations, so we had a nested design to look at potential changes in flow and sediment as the watershed area increased downstream. There were 3 control subbasins that were used to predict what should occur for flow and sediment. Harvesting was done from 85 to 92 under the modern forest practice rules with 4 timber sales. And in terms of yarding, almost all of it was cable yarded. The pink areas shown here were cable yarded, about 80% of the area. A little bit of tractor yarding on the ridges. The roads were built on the ridges, and we had riparian buffer strips or watercourse lake protection zones as mandated by the rules. So when I was a little bit younger, but you can see that we did build the Parshall flumes to monitor flow and allow sediment to pass through the headwater basins. We had a calibration period from 85 to 89. The instrumentation by now was much advanced. We had ISCO pumping samplers in the 80s to take water samples that were triggered by a HP 71 calculator that had an algorithm to increase sampling frequency on storm events. Air photo that I took in 1990 between logging units J and L, illustrating the riparian buffer that we had. And another air photo that I took in 1991 illustrating what the upper part of the North Fork looked like with our clear cutting that occurred. And we did have 3 subbasins that were controlled. Subwatershed H or Hen was one of our controls. We had some photo points that were set up. You can see the pre-burn on the left. We did broadcast burning of 4 of the harvest units, burned a little hotter than we would have liked in Unit J. In the middle there, and then you can see 4 years later the vegetation, including pampas grass, that came back. After about 10 years, we did pre-commercial thinning for the redwood clumps, reduced basal area about 75%, and established inventory plots to look at growth over time. Rapidly here for some North Fork results, we did have peak flows increasing almost 30% for 2-year recurrence interval storm events. That was mainly due to changes in interception loss and evapotranspiration. Jack Lewis generated equations to predict changes in peak flows that we've used in evaluating timber harvesting plans. Peak flow changes were related to soil wetness, the part of the watershed that was logged, the storm size, and the time since logging. In terms of sediment, we had about an 89% increase at the North Fork weir after logging the North Fork with clear cuts, mainly related to one landslide event that occurred right above the North Fork weir, and that's shown in this photo here. Even with that landslide event, the South Fork, logged before the modern rules, produced 2.4 to 3.7 times more suspended sediment than the clear-cut log North Fork. And if you went just 100 yards or 100 meters above the North Fork weir pond, the amount of sediment was much, much less, only about 5% above what was expected. So this landslide was really the dominant thing that jacked up the sediment for the North Fork. In-channel erosion and landslides are our main sediment sources, not roads that were on ridges. in channel erosion, such as gulling and channel incision. Channel migration was the major source of sediment during times when we didn't have large landslides. The landslides that we did have seemed to be elevated in terms of the number of large landslides, and mostly were near roads, and thought that road drainage influenced them. Water temperature increased about 2 degrees C for the North Fork, and it was elevated up to 11 degrees C in the South Fork. Nutrient cycling, we had Randy Dahlgren, who's still a professor here at UC Davis, look at nutrients. We did have some increases in nitrate and nitrogen, but they're relatively low compared to some of the other studies, such as Hubbard Brook in the eastern United States. And that was largely attributed to rapid regrowth of the sprouting redwoods. Here's a plot that Randy put together for nitrate nitrogen. See, it's highest near the clear cut, but quite a bit reduced by the time it exited the watershed at the North Fork Weir. We had Alan Knight, who was a professor now retired at UC Davis, look at stream biology. They looked at macroinvertebrates, they looked at algae, and they looked at leaf decay rates over an 8-year period before, during, and after logging. Alan and his grad students had sampling sites along the main stem at 5 tributary locations, actually sampling above and below the tributary entries. They put out clay tiles to look at algae and found that algae was significantly increased. Thought that was mainly due to increased light, but might have been related to water temperature increases or nutrient increases. They put out artificial substrate samplers, or rock packs, rock bags for macroinvertebrates, and found that the macroinvertebrate density and diversity did increase, and increased as well for the EPT species. And for functional feeding groups, they found scrapers, shredders, and collector feeders were increased. The leaf decay rates also were elevated for 2 years. They really weren't able to tease out too well what was the most dominant effect. They thought it was increased light, but it may have been increased nutrients and temperature, so that really needs further research. Fish have been looked at as well, and you'll hear more from Sean Gallagher, but there's been no dramatic changes in the North Fork due to high variability for coho and steelhead young of the year. So just in summary, I think we've learned a lot in the first 2 experiments, and we've certainly learned that we've had reduced impacts to water quality under the modern forest practice rules. We have learned the things that we have come up with strategies to reduce the impacts that other foresters have used throughout the coast ranges. These results have been applied broadly by foresters and the reviewing agencies. And the 3rd experiment is in play. We're working on it actively, and we'll learn more and build on what we've learned from the first 2 experiments. And with that, I'm going to bring up Sally to talk about the 3rd experiment.